There is no pain deeper than watching your child slip away while you stand powerless to save them. For any parent, it is the nightmare that haunts every sleepless night. Jorund the Ironhand, a Viking warrior, faces this terror when he returns home, to find his daughter Alva struck by a mysterious illness. She cannot walk or speak, and the village healers say her spirit is fading. Old Norse tradition claims only a complete family can convince the gods to save a dying child during the winter solstice. With no wife and time running out, this fierce warrior makes a desperate choice. He asks Signe, the baker's daughter, to pretend to be his wife for 1 week. She agrees, not for money, but to help save little Alva. As the solstice approaches and snow begins to fall, their fake marriage starts to feel surprisingly real. Can a week of pretending create something powerful enough to bring a child back from the edge of death? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried the scent of pine and salt across the fjord as Jorund's longship rounded the familiar bend toward home. After 3 months raiding the eastern settlements, his men were eager to return to hearth and family. The sight of their village nestled against the mountainside should have filled him with relief, but something felt wrong. No smoke rose from his own dwelling's roof hole, and the usual sounds of daily life seemed muted. Jorund touched the leather pouch at his belt, where Alva's wooden doll waited, a gift he'd commissioned from a skilled carver in the conquered lands. The tiny figure wore a dress painted in bright blues and yellows, with intricate knots carved into her flowing hair. He'd imagined his daughter's face lighting up when she saw it, her small hands tracing the delicate details as she listened to his stories of distant shores. The harbour master, Olaf, greeted the returning warriors with less enthusiasm than usual. His weathered face bore deep lines of worry as he helped secure the ship's ropes. "Jorund," he said quietly, pulling the warrior aside, "you need to know before you reach your hall." The words that followed struck him harder than any battle axe. Alva had fallen ill just a week after his departure. It began with a fever that broke after 3 days, leaving her weak but seemingly recovering. Then came the morning when she simply could not rise from her sleeping furs. Her legs refused to obey her will, and by evening, her voice had faded to barely a whisper. Thora, the village's most respected healer, had tried everything. Herbs gathered under the full moon, chants passed down through generations, even offerings to Frigg and Air, the goddesses of healing. Nothing worked. Each day, Alva grew more distant, as if her spirit were slowly departing her small body. Jorund's hands trembled as he listened, his warrior's composure cracking like ice in spring. He thought of his wife, Astrid, who had died giving birth to Alva 8 winters ago. The midwife said her final words were a promise to watch over their daughter from Valhalla. Now it seemed the gods were calling Alva to join her mother, and Jorund felt powerless to stop them. He ran through the village streets, his heavy boots echoing off the wooden walkways. Neighbors stepped aside, their faces filled with sympathy and fear. Death was no stranger to their harsh world, but watching a child fade away struck everyone deeply. Children were the future, the continuation of bloodlines, the promise that their struggles held meaning. His hall stood at the edge of the settlement, built from stout pine logs and topped with turf that grew green in summer. Now in the grip of early winter, everything looked grey and lifeless. The carved dragon heads that protected his roof seemed to mock him with their fierce expressions. What protection had they offered his daughter? Inside, the main room felt tomb-like. The central fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on walls adorned with weapons and shields from his years of warfare. But his eyes went immediately to the small form lying on a bed of furs near the hearth. Alva looked so tiny, almost lost among the thick pelts. Her once bright hair had dulled to the color of winter wheat, and her skin held an unhealthy pallor. But her eyes, those deep blue eyes that reminded him so much of Astrid, still held awareness. They tracked his movement as he approached, and her lips curved in the faintest shadow of a smile. "Papa," she whispered, the word barely audible. Jorund knelt beside her, his massive frame making her seem even more fragile. He pulled the wooden doll from his pouch, placing it gently in her still hands. "I brought you a friend from far away." Her fingers closed weakly around the carved figure, and for a moment he saw a flicker of the bright child she had been. But it faded quickly, leaving behind the hollow look that had become too familiar. Thora emerged from the shadows where she'd been keeping watch. The healer was a woman of perhaps 50 winters, her greying hair braided with protective charms and healing herbs. Lines of exhaustion marked her face. She'd barely left Alva's side since the illness struck. "I've tried everything I know," she said, her voice heavy with defeat. "The fever spirits have left her, but something else lingers. It's as if part of her soul has already begun the journey to the other realm." Jorund's jaw clenched. "There must be something. Some remedy you haven't considered." Thora's eyes held ancient sadness. "There is one thing. An old tradition, older than the conversion to the White Christ that some villages have adopted. Our ancestors believed that a child's spirit could be anchored to this world through the power of a complete family circle. I don't understand. A mother's love, a father's strength, the warmth of a true home. These create a bond strong enough to call back a departing soul. But it must be genuine, blessed by the gods during the sacred time." She gestured toward the small altar in the corner, where offerings to the household spirits waited. "The winter solstice approaches. If Alva were part of a complete family, when the longest night passes into the returning light, the old ways say her spirit might choose to remain." The implications hit him like a physical blow. He had no wife. Astrid was 8 years in her grave, and he'd never considered taking another woman to his bed. His heart had died with her, leaving only his love for their daughter to keep him anchored to life. "But I am alone," he said, the words tasting like ashes. "Yes," Thora replied gently, "and that may be why the gods are calling her home. A warrior's hall, no matter how strong, cannot provide the maternal warmth a child's soul craves." Jorund stared at his daughter's pale face, watching the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. The wooden doll lay forgotten in her loosened grip, its bright colors a stark contrast to her grey pallor. Somewhere in his mind, a desperate plan began to form, one that would require him to do something that went against every principle of his warrior's pride. He would need to find a woman willing to play the role of wife and mother, to create the illusion of a complete family strong enough to fool the gods themselves. It was madness, but what choice did he have? His daughter's life hung in the balance, and he would humble himself before the entire world if it meant saving her. The question was, what woman would agree to such a strange arrangement? And more importantly, could a lie told in desperation become truth enough to satisfy the ancient powers that held Alva's fate in their hands? Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, each one a reminder that time was running short. The solstice was only 7 days away. For 2 days, Jorund barely left Alva's side. He watched her breathing grow shallower with each passing hour, her small hand occasionally tightening around the wooden doll as if it were an anchor to this world. The village life continued around them, but their hall had become a place of waiting for either a miracle or the inevitable. On the 3rd morning, as pale sunlight filtered through the smoke hole above, Jorund made his decision. He could not simply sit and watch his daughter fade away. If the gods demanded a complete family, then he would give them one, even if he had to manufacture it from desperation and deception. The question was whom to approach. Most of the eligible women in the village were either too young, already wed, or would likely flee at the mere sight of him making such an unconventional request. He needed someone with both the courage to undertake such a deception and the compassion to care genuinely for Alva during the charade. His thoughts turned to Signe, the baker's daughter. She was a woman of perhaps 25 winters, still unmarried despite her pleasant appearance and valuable skills. He'd noticed her kindness toward children when they gathered around her father's shop, drawn by the scent of fresh bread and the gentle way she spoke to them. More importantly, she was Thora's daughter, which meant she understood both the old ways and the gravity of Alva's condition. Signe had inherited her mother's healing knowledge, though she preferred the practical magic of turning grain into nourishment rather than brewing tinctures and casting protective charms. Her bread was known throughout the village, dense, dark loaves that could sustain a man through the longest winter day, and sweet pastries that made children's eyes light up with wonder. Jorund had rarely spoken to her beyond the simple transactions required to purchase bread for his household. Their worlds existed in different spheres, his defined by warfare and raiding, hers by the gentler arts of hearth and home. But now, faced with his daughter's failing health, those differences seemed insignificant. He found her in the early afternoon, working alone in the bakery while her father delivered goods to the neighboring farms. The small building was warm and filled with the yeasty scent of rising dough. Signe stood at a wooden table, her sleeves rolled up as she kneaded a particularly stubborn batch of rye bread. Her dark hair was braided practically away from her face, and flour dusted her green woolen dress. She looked up as he entered, surprise flickering across her features. Jorund filled the doorway, his broad shoulders nearly touching the frame. He had to duck slightly to avoid hitting his head on the low-hanging herbs that dried from the rafters. The contrast between his weathered mail shirt and the domestic warmth of the bakery was almost comical. "Jorund," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "I heard about Alva. I'm so sorry. How is she?" The genuine concern in her voice nearly undid his resolve. This was a woman who cared about others, even the daughter of a man she barely knew. It gave him hope that his desperate plan might actually work. "She grows weaker each day," he replied, his voice rougher than usual. "Your mother has tried everything, but the healing arts alone seem insufficient." Signe's expression grew solemn. As Thora's daughter, she understood the implications better than most. "The old sickness," she murmured. "When the spirit begins to depart before the body." Yes, Jorund struggled to find the right words for what he was about to ask. In battle, directness served him well, but this required a delicacy he'd never needed to develop. "I've come to ask something of you, something that may sound like madness." She gestured toward a small stool beside the kneading table. "Sit! Tell me what weighs on your mind." The stool groaned under his weight, and he found himself at an unusual disadvantage, looking up at her as she continued working the dough. Perhaps it was better this way, less intimidating than looming over her with his request. "Your mother spoke of an old tradition, a way to anchor a departing child's spirit through the power of a complete family during the solstice." He paused, watching her hands still in their work. "I need a wife, not truly just for the ritual. For 1 week to fulfill the requirements of the ancient laws." Signe's hands remained frozen in the dough, her knuckles white with flour and surprise. When she finally looked at him, her eyes held a mixture of shock and something else, perhaps understanding. "You're asking me to pretend to be your wife?" "Yes." The word came out harsher than he intended. "I know it's unusual. I know it asks much of your reputation and your time. But Alva is dying, and this may be her only chance." She resumed kneading, but slower now, her movements thoughtful. "What would this pretense entail?" "I assume more than simply standing beside you during a ceremony." Jorund had considered this. "You would need to move into my hall for the week leading to solstice. We would need to present ourselves as a true family, sharing meals, tending to Alva together, participating in the household rituals that mark a proper home." He hesitated. "There would be no expectation of, that is, the arrangement would be strictly for appearance. You would have your own sleeping space, and your honor would remain untouched." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sounds of dough being worked and the distant crackling of the ovens. Signe's face revealed nothing of her thoughts, but Jorund could sense the enormity of what he was asking. A woman's reputation was precious in their society, and even the appearance of impropriety could have lasting consequences. "Why me?" she finally asked. The question caught him off guard. He'd expected immediate refusal or demands for compensation. "Because you understand healing. Because you're kind to children." Because you're brave enough to consider such a request instead of throwing me out immediately. A small smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. Because I'm unmarried and unlikely to be missed if scandal ruins my prospects? Her directness surprised him. That's not, I wouldn't ask this if I thought it would harm you. Wouldn't you? She shaped the dough into a round loaf and set it aside to rise. A man desperate to save his child might ask anything of anyone. It's not necessarily wrong, but let's be honest about what this is. Jorund felt heat rise in his cheeks. She was right, of course. His desperation was making him selfish, asking her to risk her future for his daughter's life. I can offer compensation, he said. Silver from my raiding, or no. The word was firm but not angry. If I agree to this, it won't be for payment. It would be for Alva. And because sometimes the old ways demand sacrifices from all of us. Hope stirred in his chest. Then you'll consider it? She moved to another portion of dough, this one destined for the sweet honey cakes that children loved. Her movements were precise, practiced, meditative. I need to understand exactly what you're proposing. This ancient ritual, what does it require beyond our presence? According to your mother, we must live as a true family for 7 days before the solstice. We eat together, tend the household fires together, and care for Alva as her parents. On the longest night, we perform the traditional blessing, asking the gods to bind our family circle and keep our child safe in this world. And you believe this will work? Jorund's shoulders sagged slightly. I don't know, but it's the only path left to us. The healers have exhausted their knowledge, and each day I watch more of her spirit slip away. If there's even a chance the old ways can call her back, I have to try. Signe nodded slowly. I'll need to speak with my mother. This isn't just about healing. It's about invoking powers that deserve respect and caution. She met his eyes directly. But yes, I'll help you save your daughter. The relief that washed over him was so intense, it left him dizzy. He stood abruptly, the stool scraping against the stone floor. Thank you. I thank you. Don't thank me yet, she said practically. We have a great deal of work ahead of us if we're going to convince the gods that our arrangement is genuine. Full sentiment won't save Alva, only something real enough to bridge the gap between this world and the next. As Jorund left the bakery, snow was falling more heavily, coating the village in pristine white. 4 days until he would need to begin the charade that might save his daughter's life. 4 days to prepare for the most important performance of his existence. Behind him, Signe continued working her dough, but her mind was already turning toward the enormous task ahead. She was about to become a wife and mother to strangers, and somehow make it real enough to satisfy ancient powers that held life and death in their hands. The next morning brought news that chilled Jorund more than the winter wind. Alva had not spoken a single word since waking, and her grip on the wooden doll had loosened completely. Thora sat beside the child's bed, her face grave as she checked for signs that might not be visible to a father's desperate eyes. Her breathing is more labored, the healer reported quietly, and her skin grows cool despite the warmth of the fire. We may have even less time than I first believed. Jorund knelt beside his daughter, studying her pale face. The bright, curious child who had once peppered him with questions about his voyages now lay silent as stone. Only the slight movement of her chest indicated life still flickered within her small frame. How long? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Perhaps 3 days, maybe 4 if we're fortunate. Thora's voice carried the weight of too many similar pronouncements over her years of healing. The spirit world calls to her strongly now. 3 days meant they would need to begin the ritual immediately, with no time for careful preparation or gradual adjustment. Jorund felt panic rising in his throat. How could they possibly create a convincing family bond in mere hours? A soft knock at the door interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Signe entered carrying a large woven basket, her cheeks flushed from the cold morning air. She had braided her hair differently, he noticed, in the more elaborate style typically worn by married women. Even this small detail showed how seriously she was taking their arrangement. I brought supplies, she said simply, setting the basket near the hearth. If we're to convince anyone that I belong in this household, I'll need to make it look like I've always been here. From the basket, she withdrew items that spoke of domestic permanence: a spare dress and woolen stockings, a bone comb decorated with intricate carvings, a small wooden box containing herbs and threads for mending, and a beautifully crafted oil lamp that would cast warm light during the long winter evenings. But it was the last item that caught Jorund's attention, a small cloth bundle that she handled with particular care. When she unwrapped it, he saw it contained several pieces of delicate jewelry: silver arm rings, a brooch shaped like a flying raven, and a pendant bearing protective runes. "These were my mother's when she was young," Signe explained, fastening the raven brooch to her dress. "A wife would wear such things, especially during important rituals." The transformation was subtle but striking. With her hair styled for marriage and the fine jewelry adorning her simple dress, Signe looked like she truly belonged in a prosperous warrior's hall. But more than that, she carried herself differently, with the quiet confidence of a woman secure in her place and role. Thora observed these preparations with knowing eyes. "You understand what you're attempting," she said to her daughter. "This isn't simply play acting. To reach the spirit realm, the ritual requires genuine emotion, real bonds. The gods cannot be fooled by mere performance." "I know, Mother." Signe moved to Alva's bedside, her expression softening as she looked down at the still child. "But sometimes genuine emotion can grow from the smallest seeds if we tend them properly." She reached out tentatively, then gently brushed a strand of hair from Alva's forehead. The child's eyes fluttered open at the touch, focusing with apparent difficulty on this new face. "Hello, little one," Signe said softly. "I'm Signe. I'm going to stay with you and your father for a while." To Jorund's amazement, Alva's lips curved in the faintest whisper of a smile. Her hand moved weakly, reaching toward the stranger who spoke with such warmth. Signe caught the small fingers gently in her own, and for a moment, some color seemed to return to the child's pale cheeks. "She likes you," Jorund said, wonder evident in his voice. "Children often sense things adults miss," Thora observed. "Perhaps she recognizes a kindred spirit." As the day progressed, Signe set about making subtle changes to the hall that would support their deception. She rearranged the sleeping furs to suggest a married couple's shared space, while ensuring she actually had privacy in a small alcove. She hung her spare dress alongside Jorund's tunics, and placed her personal items among his belongings with the casual familiarity of long cohabitation. But it was her interaction with Alva that truly impressed him. Signe seemed to instinctively understand how to care for a sick child, adjusting pillows for comfort, offering sips of honey-sweetened water, and maintaining a steady stream of gentle conversation even when Alva couldn't respond. "In my father's bakery," she told the child while checking the temperature of a warming stone, "we have a cat named Bjorn who thinks he owns the entire shop. He's grey with white paws, and he has the loudest purr you've ever heard. When you're feeling better, I'll take you to meet him." These weren't empty promises made to a dying child, Jorund realized. Signe spoke as if she truly believed Alva would recover, as if their strange arrangement would somehow work. Her faith was both inspiring and heartbreaking. When evening came, they faced their first real test, sharing a meal as a family. Signe had prepared a simple but nourishing stew from ingredients she'd brought, and the smell filled the hall with warmth and comfort. She served Jorund first, as a wife would, then prepared a small bowl of broth for Alva. "Can you try just a little?" she coaxed, supporting the child's head while offering tiny spoonfuls. "You need to keep your strength up." Alva managed only a few sips, but it was more than she'd taken in the previous day. Jorund found himself watching Signe's patient ministrations with growing appreciation. This woman, who barely knew them, was already showing more maternal care than many actual mothers might provide. After the meal, as they sat before the fire with Alva resting between them, an awkward silence fell. They were playing the roles of husband and wife, but they remained virtual strangers. Jorund struggled to think of appropriate conversation. "Tell me about your raiding," Signe said finally. Alva should hear stories of her father's adventures. It was a clever solution. Allow them to talk while including the child in their interaction. Jorund found himself describing his recent journey to the eastern settlements, carefully editing out the violence while emphasizing the interesting people and places he'd encountered. There was a market town built on stilts over a great marsh, he told them. The people there had learned to make boats so light they could navigate channels barely wider than a man's outstretched arms. Their children could walk on water, or so it seemed to us land-bound Norse. Alva's eyes had opened during the story, and though she didn't speak, she seemed to be listening. Signe asked questions that encouraged him to elaborate, creating the illusion of a family sharing the day's events around their hearth. But as the evening deepened and it came time for sleep, the limitations of their arrangement became apparent. They were still strangers, bound together only by desperation and a child's need. The easy intimacy of a real marriage would take time to develop, time they might not have. Tomorrow we should visit the neighbors, Signe suggested as she settled into her alcove. People need to see us together, accepting our presence as natural. Jorund nodded from his place beside the main fire. And we should make an offering at the temple. A new wife would want to present herself to the gods. These practical preparations were necessary, but they felt hollow. How could they create something real enough to save Alva when their own connection remained so fragile? As he listened to the quiet sounds of Signe settling for the night and Alva's labored breathing, Jorund wondered if they were attempting the impossible. Outside, the wind howled through the village, carrying with it the promise of the long winter to come. Time was running short, and they had barely begun to build the foundation that might save his daughter's life. Dawn brought their first public test as a supposedly married couple. Word had spread through the village that Jorund had taken a wife, news that traveled with the speed of winter wind through their close-knit community. Neighbors who had known him as a solitary widower for 8 years were naturally curious about this sudden development. Astrid Olafsdottir, the blacksmith's wife, and one of the village's most influential matrons, arrived shortly after sunrise with a basket of herbs and what she claimed was a traditional welcome offering. But Jorund recognized the visit for what it truly was, an inspection. "Signe dear," Astrid said warmly, though her eyes were sharp with assessment. "What wonderful news about your marriage." "So sudden, though, we heard no announcement of courtship." Signe handled the probe with admirable composure. "Sometimes the heart knows its path without need for lengthy deliberation," she replied, accepting the basket gracefully. With little Alva so ill, Jorund and I realized that life is too precious to waste on unnecessary delays. It was a clever response. Jorund thought. It explained both the speed of their union and positioned it as something done for the child's benefit. Astrid's expression softened slightly, though suspicion still lingered in her manner. "And how are you finding married life in a warrior's hall?" The older woman continued. "Quite different from your father's bakery, I imagine." "Every household has its own rhythms," Signe answered diplomatically. "I'm learning to blend my skills with the needs of my new family." As if summoned by their conversation, Alva stirred on her bed of furs, making a small sound that might have been an attempt at speech. Both women immediately turned their attention to the child, and Jorund watched as something remarkable happened. Signe moved to Alva's side with the natural instinct of a mother, adjusting the child's position and checking her forehead for fever. But more importantly, Astrid's demeanor shifted as she observed this tender care. The older woman's suspicions seemed to melt away in the face of obvious, genuine concern. "Poor little dove," Astrid murmured, reaching out to stroke Alva's pale cheek. "The whole village has been praying for her recovery." "Your prayers are welcomed," Signe said softly. "We believe the gods will hear our pleas, especially now that she has a complete family circle to protect her." The reference to the old traditions was subtle but unmistakable. Astrid nodded knowingly. She was old enough to remember when such beliefs held stronger sway over daily life. After the blacksmith's wife departed, other neighbors followed throughout the morning. Each visit brought its own challenges as people struggled to reconcile the Jorund they knew a grim, solitary warrior with this newly domesticated version who had supposedly found love again, Eric the Younger. One of Jorund's shield brothers proved particularly difficult to convince. He arrived in the afternoon, ostensibly to check on Alva, but clearly seeking to understand his friend's sudden transformation. "You've been holding secrets, brother," Eric said with forced joviality as he studied Signe. "When did this courtship begin?" "I thought your heart was buried with Astrid." The comment struck closer to truth than was comfortable. Jorund felt Signe's eyes on him, waiting to see how he would handle this more direct challenge. "A man can carry love for the dead while still finding room for the living," he replied carefully. "Signe has shown me that honoring Astrid's memory doesn't require endless solitude. It wasn't entirely false," he realized. Something about Signe's presence had indeed begun to thaw the frozen places in his heart. Though he couldn't yet name what that something was, Eric's gaze moved to where Signe sat beside Alva, singing a soft lullaby while brushing the child's hair with gentle strokes. The scene was so naturally maternal that even his skeptical friend seemed moved by it. "The child needs a mother's care," Eric admitted quietly. "Perhaps the gods guided your choice." "Perhaps they did," Jorund agreed, surprised to find he meant it. As the day wore on, Signe proved herself remarkably adept at managing their domestic charade. She prepared meals with the efficiency of long practice, mended a tear in one of his tunics as if she'd been doing his repairs for years, and responded to questions about their relationship with just enough detail to satisfy curiosity, without creating contradictions. But it was her continued attention to Alva that truly impressed the visitors. She seemed to anticipate the child's needs before they arose, adjusting blankets against drafts, offering water before Alva showed signs of thirst, and maintaining a steady stream of gentle conversation that required no response, but clearly provided comfort. "She's been asking for you," Signe told him during a quiet moment between visitors. "Not in words, but when you're away from her side she becomes restless." Jorund moved to kneel beside his daughter, taking her small hand in his much larger one. "I'm here, little star," he murmured, using the pet name he'd called her since infancy. "Papa is here." Alva's fingers tightened slightly around his, and her eyes focused on his face with more clarity than he'd seen in days. For a moment, hope fluttered in his chest. Perhaps their efforts were already having some effect, but the moment passed quickly. Alva's grip loosened again, and her gaze grew distant. The improvement, if it could be called that, was so slight it might have been wishful thinking. "Small steps," Signe said softly, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Healing often comes gradually, like dawn breaking after the longest night." Her touch was meant to be reassuring, but it sent an unexpected jolt through him. When was the last time someone had offered him comfort rather than seeking it from him? As a warrior and protector, he was accustomed to being the source of strength for others. Having someone share that burden, even temporarily, felt both foreign and deeply welcome. Evening brought their most significant test yet. As was customary for newlyweds, several of the village's married couples arrived to share a communal meal and offer their blessings on the union. The gathering would normally be a celebration, but the shadow of Alva's illness cast a more somber tone over the proceedings. Signe handled the social complexities with remarkable grace, accepting congratulations while appropriately deflecting attention to concerns about the child. She and Jorund found themselves falling into natural patterns of cooperation. He served the ale while she distributed food. They shared the storytelling duties, and they presented a united front when well-meaning guests offered sometimes contradictory advice about Alva's care. But as the evening progressed, Jorund became increasingly aware of how their performance was affecting him. Each time Signe smiled at him across the room, each casual touch as they worked together, each moment when she referred to our daughter or our home, something inside him responded with surprising intensity. He was supposed to be pretending to be her husband, but the role was becoming alarmingly comfortable. More troubling still, he found himself watching her interactions with others, feeling a possessive satisfaction when she handled challenges to their story with clever deflection, and experiencing something that felt disturbingly like pride in her grace under pressure. When the last guest finally departed, and they were alone with the sleeping child, an awkward silence settled over the hall. They had successfully navigated their first full day as a supposed married couple, but the very success of their deception had created new complications. "You did well today," Jorund said finally. The neighbors seemed convinced. "As do I, sometimes," Signe replied quietly, avoiding his eyes as she banked the fire for the night. "It's easier to play the role than I expected." Her words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to examine. They were creating something that felt increasingly real, but built on foundations of deception and desperation. What would happen when the week ended and their arrangement came to its predetermined conclusion? For now, though, such questions had to wait. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and Alva's condition remained their primary concern. As they settled into their separate sleeping areas, both were acutely aware that their charade was evolving into something far more complex than either had anticipated. The third day brought an unexpected crisis that threatened to shatter their carefully constructed facade. Jorund woke before dawn to find Alva burning with fever, her small body racked with tremors that made the wooden doll bounce against her chest. The sudden relapse sent panic coursing through him. After 2 days of what seemed like gradual improvement, this felt like a cruel reversal. Signe appeared beside him almost instantly, as if she'd been waiting for such a moment. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Alva's pulse and breathing while her face remained calm, despite the obvious severity of the situation. "We need cool water and willow bark," she said quietly. "And send for my mother immediately." Thora arrived within minutes, her healer's instincts having already prepared her for this possibility. As she examined her young patient, her expression grew increasingly grave. "The spirit world pulls more strongly when a soul is caught between realms," she explained to the anxious parents. "Your efforts to anchor her here may have created a struggle. She's fighting to remain, but the calling grows more insistent." "What does that mean?" Jorund demanded, his warrior's need for direct answers overwhelming his usual deference to the healer's wisdom. "It means we must succeed completely, or we risk losing her more quickly than before," Thora replied bluntly. "Half measures will not suffice. The gods demand absolute conviction in your family bond, or they will claim her spirit entirely." The weight of this pronouncement settled over them like a physical burden. Their careful performance was no longer enough. They needed to create something genuine and powerful enough to satisfy divine scrutiny. But how could they manufacture real love and commitment in the space of just a few days? As if reading his thoughts, Signe moved closer to where he knelt beside Alva's bed. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "Not as her pretend mother, but as someone who wants to truly understand the child I'm trying to save." The request caught him off guard. In their focus on managing appearances and social expectations, they'd barely discussed the deeper emotional reality of what they were attempting. Now faced with the possibility of complete failure, mere surface familiarity seemed woefully inadequate. "She was born during the worst storm of winter," Jorund began hesitantly. "Astrid labored for 2 days, while the wind howled like all the wolves of Midgard. When Alva finally arrived, she was so small I could hold her entire body in my 2 hands. As he spoke, memories flooded back, moments he'd carefully locked away to avoid the pain of remembering happier times. She didn't cry like other babies. Instead, she would watch everything with these enormous blue eyes, as if she were trying to understand the world from her very first breath." Signe listened intently while continuing to bathe Alva's fevered forehead with cool cloths. "What does she love?" "What makes her laugh?" "Stories," he said immediately. "She has always been hungry for tales of distant places and brave deeds. Before I left on the last raiding, she made me promise to bring back a story for every week I was gone." His voice caught slightly. "I still owe her several tales." "Then tell them to her now," Signe urged. Let her hear your voice calling her back to the world where stories wait to be told. For the next hour, Jorund found himself sharing memories he'd never spoken aloud. How Alva had taken her first steps while chasing a butterfly through their garden. How she'd once convinced half the village children to build an elaborate fort out of hay bales. How she could identify every bird by its song and claim to understand their conversations. But more importantly, he found himself watching Signe's reactions to these stories. Her expressions revealed a growing understanding of who Alva truly was beyond her current illness. When he described his daughter's habit of collecting interesting stones from the shoreline, Signe smiled and produced a small, smooth pebble from her pocket. "I found this yesterday while walking to the market," she said, placing it beside the wooden doll. "Something about its shape reminded me of her, small but perfectly formed, weathered by storms but still beautiful." The gesture was so naturally maternal that it took Jorund's breath away. This wasn't performance or obligation. It was genuine affection beginning to bloom between a woman and a child who desperately needed mothering. As the day progressed, they settled into a different rhythm than before. Instead of focusing on maintaining their public facade, they turned their attention inward, creating moments of authentic family connection. Signe taught Jorund how to braid Alva's hair in the intricate patterns that young girls favored, while he showed her the proper way to maintain the various weapons that decorated their walls. "A warrior's wife should understand his tools," he explained, as she ran her fingers along the blade of his favorite sayax. "Not to use them necessarily, but to respect their purpose and care. And a baker's husband should understand bread," she countered, producing a small loaf from her morning's work. "This is made with honey and nuts, foods that strengthen the blood and warm the spirit. Alva should eat some when her fever breaks." These exchanges revealed deeper truths about both of them. Jorund discovered that Signe possessed not just kindness, but genuine wisdom about healing and nurturing. Her knowledge complemented her mother's more mystical approaches with practical understanding of nutrition and comfort. Meanwhile, Signe began to see past Jorund's intimidating exterior to the devoted father and thoughtful man beneath his warrior's facade. The evening brought an unexpected visitor, Magnus the law speaker, the village's most respected elder and keeper of traditional knowledge. His arrival was significant. As the one who would perform the solstice blessing, his approval of their family unit was crucial to the ritual's success. Magnus was a man of perhaps 60 winters, with silver-white hair braided with beads that marked his status and wisdom. His pale blue eyes seemed to see through surface appearances to deeper truths. When he entered their hall, both Jorund and Signe felt the weight of his scrutiny. "I have come to understand what you attempt," he said without preamble, settling himself on a stool near Alva's bed. "The old ways demand more than ceremony. They require truth that resonates in the bones and blood." Jorund felt his throat tighten. If Magnus saw through their deception, the entire plan would collapse. "We seek only to save my daughter," he said carefully. "As any parent would," Magnus agreed. "But tell me, Signe Thoradottir, what brings you to stand as mother to a child not born of your body?" The question was direct and dangerous. Signe met the old man's gaze steadily, and when she spoke, her voice carried absolute conviction. "Because she needs mothering, and I have mothering to give," she said simply. "Because a child's life matters more than convention or comfort. Because sometimes the gods place us exactly where we need to be, even if we don't understand their design at first." Magnus studied her for a long moment, then turned his attention to where Alva lay, still and pale. "And you, Jorund Eriksson, what has this woman brought to your hall beyond mere presence?" The answer came to him with startling clarity. "Peace," he said quietly. "For 8 years this has been a house of mourning. She has brought hope where there was only grief, warmth where there was only duty." It wasn't the answer he'd planned to give, but it was absolutely true. Somewhere in the past 3 days, Signe had indeed transformed their space from a monument to loss into something that felt like a living home again. Magnus nodded slowly. "The child stirs," he observed, and indeed Alva's eyes had opened during their conversation. Though she remained too weak to speak, her gaze moved between the three adults with apparent awareness. "She listens to the voices of those who would claim her," the law speaker said. "On the night of solstice she will choose, this world or the next. Your task is to make this world more appealing than whatever calls from beyond." After Magnus departed, they sat in contemplative silence beside Alva's bed. The old man's words had crystallized something they'd both been feeling but hadn't dared acknowledge. Their arrangement was evolving into something that transcended its original desperate purpose. "Are we still pretending?" Signe asked softly, her hand resting gently on Alva's forehead. Jorund considered the question seriously. When he looked at Signe now, he no longer saw a stranger performing a role. He saw a woman who had seamlessly woven herself into the fabric of their damaged family, bringing skills and perspectives that complemented his own in ways he'd never imagined possible. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "Are you?" Her smile was soft but complicated. "Sometimes I forget this has an ending. Sometimes it feels like we've always been this way." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications they weren't quite ready to explore. Outside, the wind carried the promise of more snow, and time continued its relentless march toward the solstice. But inside their hall, something fragile and precious was taking root, something that might indeed prove strong enough to call a dying child back to life. The fourth morning brought an unexpected complication that threatened to unravel everything they'd built. Gunnar Eriksson, Jorund's younger brother, arrived unannounced from his settlement 2 fjords over. He came bearing news of successful trading ventures and gifts for his niece. Completely unaware of the delicate deception being maintained, Gunnar was everything Jorund was not: quick to laugh, easy with words, and charming in ways that came naturally rather than through careful effort. At 28 winters, he possessed the same powerful build as his older brother, but carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never known defeat or devastating loss. "Brother," he called out as he strode into the hall, his voice booming with characteristic enthusiasm. "I bring silver from the southern markets and tales that will make Alva's eyes shine with wonder." His words died as he took in the scene before him. His brother sitting beside a sickbed, a strange woman tending the pale child, and an atmosphere of quiet tension that spoke of crisis rather than celebration. "What has happened here?" Gunnar asked, his jovial manner evaporating as he knelt beside Alva's still form. "She's so thin, so pale. How long has she been like this?" Jorund exchanged a quick glance with Signe, recognizing the danger inherent in this unexpected arrival. Gunnar knew him too well to be easily deceived, and any inconsistency in their story could destroy the fragile belief structure they'd been building within the community. "She fell ill shortly after I returned from raiding," Jorund explained carefully. "The healers believe her spirit grows weary of this world. And who is this?" Gunnar's attention shifted to Signe, his expression curious rather than suspicious. As yet he had no reason to doubt what he was seeing. "I am Signe," she said simply, rising to greet him properly. "Jorund's wife." The silence that followed was deafening. Gunnar's face cycled through confusion, disbelief, and finally a kind of stunned understanding. He knew his brother well enough to recognize the signs of desperate measures. "Wife?" he repeated slowly. "Brother, you've been a widower for 8 years. You've turned away every woman who showed interest, claimed your heart died with Astrid. Now suddenly you have a wife?" The challenge was direct and dangerous. Signe stepped closer to Jorund, not quite touching but close enough to suggest intimate familiarity. "Sometimes grief needs time to run its course before the heart can open again," she said quietly. "Your brother honored Astrid's memory, but Alva needs a mother's care." It was a delicate response that acknowledged Gunnar's valid concerns while providing a plausible explanation for the sudden marriage. But Jorund could see the wheels turning in his brother's sharp mind, connecting details that might not quite align. "When did this marriage take place?" Gunnar pressed. "I heard no announcement, received no invitation to witness the ceremony." There was no ceremony, Jorund said, choosing his words carefully. We spoke our vows before the household gods, with Thora as witness. Alva's condition required urgency over tradition. Again, it was a reasonable explanation that skirted the edges of truth. Norse custom did allow for such informal marriages in emergency circumstances. But Gunnar's expression remained skeptical. "Show me your hands," he said suddenly to Signe. The request caught both of them off guard. Signe extended her hands hesitantly, uncertain what Gunnar sought to prove. "No calluses from working a warrior's household," he observed, studying her palms. "These are a baker's hands, soft from flour, skilled with dough, but unused to the heavier labors of managing a fighting man's hall." It was a perceptive observation that revealed more investigative skill than Jorund had credited his brother with possessing. Before either could respond, however, Alva stirred on her bed of furs, making a small sound that drew all attention to her. The child's eyes opened, focusing with apparent effort on the new face above her. Gunnar's features softened immediately as he gazed down at his niece. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of its previous suspicion. "Hello, little star," he said gently, using the same pet name Jorund favored. "Uncle Gunnar has brought you presents from the southern lands." From his travel pack, he produced a collection of items that spoke of careful selection rather than casual acquisition. There was a necklace of amber beads that glowed like captured sunlight, a small silver arm ring sized perfectly for a child's wrist, and most remarkably, a tiny carved whale made from some dark wood that felt warm to the touch. "This came from traders who sail the northern seas," he explained, placing the whale in Alva's weak grasp. "They say it carries the strength of Aegir's realm and will protect children who love the water." For the first time in days, Alva's fingers closed firmly around an object. Her grip on the whale was noticeably stronger than her hold on anything else had been, and a faint flush of color seemed to return to her cheeks. Signe watched this interaction with growing understanding. "She knows you," she observed. "You visit often?" "As often as I can manage," Gunnar confirmed. "Alva has been the light of my life since the day she was born. I've watched her grow from a tiny infant who could fit in my two hands to a bright child who asks more questions than a dozen scholars." His devotion to the child was unmistakable, and it seemed to resolve whatever doubts he might have harbored about the adult's strange situation. Whether or not Jorund and Signe's marriage was entirely conventional, they were clearly united in their care for Alva. "What do the healers say?" Gunnar asked, his attention shifting back to the larger crisis. Thora, who had been quietly observing from her corner, stepped forward to explain the situation. As she described the gradual weakening of Alva's connection to the living world and the potential power of the solstice ritual, Gunnar's expression grew increasingly troubled. "The old ways," he murmured. "I thought such beliefs had faded with our grandparents' generation." "They fade until desperation calls them back," Thora replied pragmatically. "Modern healing has its limits. Sometimes we must reach deeper into the well of ancient wisdom, and this ritual requires a complete family. Father, mother, child, bound by genuine love and commitment," she confirmed. "The gods cannot be deceived by false sentiment, but they may be moved by authentic devotion." Gunnar studied Jorund and Signe with new eyes, searching for signs of the genuine connection the ritual would demand. What he saw seemed to satisfy some internal criteria. "Then I will support whatever you're attempting," he declared. "Alva's life matters more than convention or comfort." His words echoed Signe's earlier statement to Magnus, and Jorund felt a surge of gratitude for his brother's acceptance. But as the day progressed, Gunnar's presence introduced new complications to their careful balance. The younger man's natural charm and easy manner with Signe created an uncomfortable dynamic. He treated her with the casual familiarity typically reserved for sisters-in-law, asking about her family and background in ways that required careful navigation to avoid contradictions. More troubling, Jorund found himself experiencing unfamiliar pangs of what could only be described as jealousy when Signe laughed at Gunnar's stories or responded warmly to his questions. The emotion was both irrational and inconvenient. She wasn't truly his wife, and Gunnar meant no impropriety, but it arose nonetheless with surprising intensity. "You're fortunate to have found such a woman," Gunnar commented during a moment when Signe was occupied with Alva's care. "She has a natural warmth that fills spaces I didn't realize were empty." "Yes," Jorund agreed quietly, surprised by how much he meant it. "She does, and she clearly cares for the child. That's not something that can be feigned or purchased." Again, Jorund found himself nodding with complete sincerity. Whatever the original motivation for their arrangement, Signe's affection for Alva had become unmistakably genuine. As evening approached, they gathered around the hearth for their meal, now expanded to include Gunnar's presence. The conversation flowed more easily than it had since the arrangement began, partly due to the younger man's natural ability to draw people out of themselves. "Tell us about the southern markets," Signe requested, serving portions of the rich stew she'd prepared. "What goods did you find there?" Gunnar launched into colorful descriptions of exotic spices, fine fabrics, and curious inventions that sparked the imagination. His stories painted pictures of a wider world beyond their fjord, full of possibilities and adventures that made even their harsh northern life seem part of a grander tapestry. But it was when he turned the conversation toward family memories that the evening took on deeper significance. He shared tales of Jorund's younger days, before the weight of leadership and loss had carved permanent lines into his features. "He was different before Astrid died," Gunnar said, his voice growing more serious. "Not just sadder, but somehow smaller. She brought out aspects of his character that vanished with her." Signe glanced at Jorund with new understanding. "What was he like then?" He laughed more readily. He saw wonder in simple things. He believed that happiness was not only possible, but deserved. Gunnar's expression grew thoughtful. "I've hoped for years that he might find his way back to that version of himself." The comment hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that none were quite ready to address directly. But later, as they prepared for sleep with Gunnar settled on furs near the fire, Signe approached Jorund in the relative privacy of their sleeping area. "Your brother sees something," she said quietly. "Something that goes beyond our arrangement." "What do you mean?" "He believes we're helping each other heal, not just for Alva's sake, but for our own." She paused, studying his face in the flickering firelight. "Perhaps he's not wrong." The suggestion that their pretense might be serving purposes beyond their stated goal was both thrilling and terrifying. Jorund had carefully avoided examining his own emotional responses to their situation. But Gunnar's arrival had forced certain realizations to the surface. He was beginning to care for Signe, not just as Alva's temporary caregiver, but as a woman whose presence brought qualities to his life that he hadn't realized he missed. Her wisdom, her gentle strength, her ability to find light in dark situations, these were gifts he'd grown to treasure. But acknowledging such feelings opened the door to profound complications. What would happen when their week ended? Could they transition from this intense pseudo-marriage back to being mere acquaintances? And most importantly, were his growing feelings genuine, or merely the result of desperate circumstances and proximity? These questions would have to wait for answers. Tomorrow would bring them closer to the solstice, and Alva's condition remained their primary concern. But as he settled into sleep, Jorund couldn't escape the growing certainty that their arrangement had evolved far beyond its original scope into something that might prove impossible to simply abandon when their duty was complete. The fifth morning shattered everything they thought they understood about Alva's condition. Thora arrived before dawn, her face bearing an expression of profound confusion mixed with something that might have been fear. In her weathered hands, she carried a small leather pouch that seemed to emanate an aura of significance. "We need to speak privately," she said to Jorund and Signe, glancing meaningfully toward where Gunnar still slept by the dying fire. "What I must tell you changes everything." They moved to the small alcove where Signe had been sleeping, speaking in whispers that wouldn't carry beyond the hanging tapestries that provided privacy. Thora's usual composure had cracked, revealing an uncertainty that was deeply unsettling in someone known for her wisdom and knowledge. "I have been examining Alva's symptoms more carefully," she began, her voice barely audible. "The pattern of her illness, the way her spirit seems to drift between worlds. The specific nature of her weakness, it doesn't match any natural sickness I've encountered in 40 years of healing." Signe felt her blood chill. "What are you saying?" "I believe your daughter was poisoned." The words hit Jorund like a physical blow. His hands clenched into fists as rage and disbelief warred within him. "Poisoned? By whom? Why would anyone harm a child?" Thora opened the leather pouch, revealing a collection of dried plants and roots. "These are the remnants I found hidden in your grain stores. Nightshade berries, carefully dried and ground. Foxglove leaves, processed to concentrate their essence. And this," she held up a twisted black root, "is deathcap mushroom, prepared in a way that delays its effects." The implications struck them with devastating force. Someone had deliberately introduced these substances into their household supplies, creating a slow-acting poison that would mimic the gradual fading of spirit that characterized certain mystical illnesses. But who would do such a thing? Signe asked, horror evident in her voice. "And why target a child?" "Perhaps the child was not the intended target," Thora suggested grimly. "These substances, in the concentrations I found, would be lethal to an adult over the course of several weeks. A child's smaller body would succumb more quickly, but an adult consuming the same foods would eventually suffer the same fate." Understanding dawned on Jorund with sickening clarity. Someone was trying to poison me. Alva became ill because she shares my meals. It would explain the timing, Thora confirmed. The contamination appears to have occurred shortly after your departure for the eastern raids. Someone expected you to return and gradually consume the poisoned supplies, becoming weak and eventually dying in a way that would appear natural. The revelation reframed everything about their situation. This wasn't a mystical illness calling Alva's spirit to the afterlife. It was attempted murder that had gone tragically wrong, claiming an innocent child instead of its intended victim. "Can it be treated?" Signe demanded. "If you know what's causing her condition, surely there must be antidotes." Thora's expression remained grave. "The combination of toxins has created damage that extends beyond simple poisoning. Her body has been fighting these substances for weeks, and the effort has weakened her in ways that won't quickly heal. But yes, with proper treatment, she should gradually recover." Relief flooded through Jorund, followed immediately by a burning desire for revenge. "Who had access to my grain stores? Who knew I would be returning?" "That's a question for careful investigation," Thora warned. "Whoever did this is patient and clever. They chose their moment well and covered their tracks skillfully. Rushing to accusations could be dangerous. But even as they discussed the practical aspects of the revelation, Signe found herself grappling with a more complex emotional reality. "What does this mean for us?" she asked quietly. "For our arrangement?" The question hung in the air like a sword suspended over their heads. If Alva's condition was treatable through medicine rather than mystical intervention, did their fake marriage serve any purpose? The desperate urgency that had driven them together was based on a false premise. Jorund stared at her, realizing the same troubling implications. "I suppose it means we no longer need to continue the charade." Neither of them moved to end their proximity or began making plans for Signe's departure. The relief of knowing Alva could be saved was tainted by the unexpected pain of recognizing that their time together might be ending just as it had begun to feel genuinely meaningful. "We should wake Gunnar," Signe said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. "He should know the truth about his niece's condition." They returned to the main hall, where Gunnar was beginning to stir. When they explained Thora's discovery, his reaction was immediate and explosive. The easygoing young man vanished, replaced by someone whose resemblance to Jorund was suddenly unmistakable. "Who?" he demanded, rising to his full height with warrior's readiness. "Who dared to poison my brother's household?" "We don't know yet," Jorund replied, though his mind was already turning over possibilities. "But they will answer for what they've done to Alva." As Thora began administering antidotes and treatments designed to cleanse the remaining toxins from Alva's system, the adults found themselves in an awkward position. The crisis that had brought them together was resolving, but the questions raised by 5 days of intense proximity remained unanswered. "You should know," Gunnar said during a quiet moment, "that word of your marriage has spread beyond this village. People are talking about Jorund the Ironhand finally finding love again." The implications were sobering. Their deception had taken on a life of its own, creating expectations and social obligations that couldn't simply be dismissed when convenient. "What will you tell people when I leave?" Signe asked Jorund directly. He found himself unable to answer immediately. The practical response would be to create some fiction about incompatibility discovered too late, allowing both of them to move forward with minimal damage to their reputations. But the thought of Signe simply walking out of his life felt like another kind of poison, one that would leave different but equally devastating damage. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we shouldn't be so quick to end what we've started." Signe studied his face, searching for signs of his true feelings. "Are you suggesting we continue this arrangement even though Alva no longer needs it?" "I'm suggesting that maybe Alva was never the only one who needed it." The admission hung between them, weighted with 5 days of growing connection and the recognition that their pretense had become something neither quite knew how to categorize. They had begun as strangers, united by desperation, but somewhere along the way, they had started becoming something else, something that might deserve exploration beyond the artificial constraints of their original agreement. But even as they grappled with these personal revelations, the larger question of Alva's poisoning demanded attention. Someone in their community had attempted murder, and that person remained free to try again. The immediate crisis might be resolving, but a different kind of danger was just beginning to reveal itself. Thora worked through the morning, administering treatments and monitoring Alva's response to the antidotes. By midday, the child's breathing had grown noticeably stronger, and some color had returned to her pale cheeks. The wooden doll, which had lain forgotten in her loosened grip for days, was once again clutched firmly in her small hands. "She's going to recover," Thora announced, her voice filled with the satisfaction of a healer whose skills had proven adequate to the challenge. "It will take time, and she'll need careful monitoring, but the worst is past." The news should have brought unalloyed joy, but instead it created a strange atmosphere of bittersweet uncertainty. Alva would live, but the foundations of everything else in their lives had been shaken. They had discovered that their desperate arrangement was built on false premises, but also that the feelings it had generated were surprisingly real. More troubling still, they had learned that someone close enough to access Jorund's household supplies had tried to kill him. The safety they had taken for granted in their own community was revealed to be an illusion, and the trust that bound their society together had been poisoned as surely as the grain stores. As evening approached, bringing them one day closer to the solstice that no longer held mystical significance for Alva's survival, they found themselves facing questions that were both simpler and more complex than the life or death crisis they had been managing. What did they mean to each other now that desperation no longer drove them together? Could the connection they had built survive transition to normal circumstances? And perhaps most importantly, how could they protect not just Alva, but their entire fragile new family from whoever had tried to destroy them? The answers would not come easily, but for the first time since this strange journey began, they had the luxury of time to discover them. The 6th day brought urgency of a different kind, as the reality of the poisoning attempt demanded immediate action. While Alva continued to recover under Thora's careful ministrations, Jorund and Gunnar began the grim task of investigating who had tried to murder their family. The process required delicate handling. Too direct an approach might alert the perpetrator and drive them to attempt flight or another attack. We need to think like hunters, Gunnar advised as they examined the contaminated grain stores in the early morning light. Our prey is clever and patient. They've had weeks to cover their tracks and establish alibis. Jorund studied the stone-lined storage chamber where their household supplies were kept. The space was secure, but not impenetrable. Anyone familiar with the layout of his hall could have gained access during his absence. More troubling, the poisoning required knowledge of dangerous plants and their preparation, suggesting someone with healing or herbcraft skills. "The timing troubles me most," he said, running his fingers along the edge of the grain barrel where traces of the toxins had been found. "This was done shortly after I departed for the eastern raids. Someone knew my schedule and planned accordingly. The list of people with such knowledge was uncomfortably long." His departure had been discussed openly among his shield brothers. The harbour master knew when his ship was expected to return, and various merchants and neighbours had been informed so they could plan their own activities around his absence. Signe joined them in the storage chamber, her presence adding another perspective to their investigation. "Your mother says the poisoning required specific knowledge," she said to Gunnar. "These aren't common plants that anyone might stumble across. Someone with training prepared these substances. That narrows our suspects considerably," Gunnar observed. "How many people in the village possess such knowledge?" They made a list, Thora herself, though she was clearly innocent. Old Bjorn, the herb seller, who supplied many of the village's medicinal needs. Astrid Olafsdottir, the blacksmith's wife, who was known for her skill with healing poultices, and perhaps 2 or 3 others who had learned basic herbcraft from older relatives, but eliminating suspects proved more difficult than identifying them. Each person they considered had reasonable explanations for their whereabouts during the relevant time period, and all seemed to possess genuine concern for Alva's welfare. The investigation required them to examine not just opportunity and knowledge, but motive, and there the picture became murkier still. "Who benefits from your death?" Signe asked bluntly as they returned to the main hall. It was a warrior's question, direct and practical. Jorund considered it carefully, reviewing the various conflicts and rivalries that might have created enemies desperate enough for murder. "My lands would pass to Gunnar," he said slowly. "But he has his own prosperous settlement and no need for additional holdings. What about your position as leader of the raiding crews?" Gunnar suggested. "Several younger men have ambitions in that direction. Perhaps, but the choice of poison seems wrong for that kind of ambition. A rival warrior would more likely challenge me directly or arrange an accident during combat. This level of subtlety suggests someone who couldn't face me in open conflict." As they discussed possibilities, Alva stirred on her bed of furs, making a sound that drew their immediate attention. For the first time in days she was attempting to speak, though her voice was barely audible. "Papa," she whispered, the word clearer than any sound she'd made since the illness began. Jorund was beside her instantly, taking her small hand in his much larger one. "I'm here, little star. How do you feel?" "Thirsty," she managed, and the simple request brought tears to his eyes. It was such a normal, everyday need, the kind of thing a healthy child might ask for dozens of times each day. Signe appeared with a cup of water sweetened with honey, supporting Alva's head while she managed several small sips. The improvement was remarkable, though she remained weak. The alert awareness in her eyes was unmistakably that of a child returning to the world of the living. "Better," Alva said after drinking, her gaze moving between the adults around her bed. When her eyes settled on Signe, confusion flickered across her pale features. "Who are you?" The question struck like a physical blow. In their focus on maintaining their deception for the outside world, they hadn't considered how to explain Signe's presence to Alva herself. The child had been too ill to register much about her surroundings, but now she was alert enough to notice the strange woman who seemed to belong in their household. "This is Signe," Jorund said carefully. "She's been helping to take care of you while you were sick, like Thora grandmother." Alva asked, using her pet name for the healer. "Something like that," Signe replied gently, smoothing the child's hair with maternal tenderness. "I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed to get better." It was a truthful if incomplete explanation, but it seemed to satisfy Alva's limited energy for questions. She drifted back to sleep, still holding Signe's hand, leaving the adults to grapple with yet another complication their arrangement had created. "She'll want more complete answers when she's stronger," Signe observed quietly. "Yes," Jorund agreed, "along with everyone else in the village." The investigation resumed in the afternoon, when Magnus the law speaker arrived with disturbing news. His network of contacts throughout the region had provided information that cast their situation in an even more troubling light. "There have been other incidents," he reported, settling his aged frame beside their fire. "3 families in neighboring settlements have suffered mysterious illnesses over the past season. In each case, a prominent warrior or leader became sick and died after what appeared to be natural causes. The pattern was chilling. Someone was systematically targeting the leadership of their region, using poison to eliminate obstacles to some larger plan. Jorund's case was unique only in that Alva had become ill first, alerting them to the danger before the intended victim had been eliminated. "Do you suspect coordination?" Gunnar asked. "Someone organizing these attacks from a distance?" "It's possible," Magnus replied. "But it could also be someone local who's been traveling between settlements, using knowledge of each community to eliminate specific individuals. To what end?" Signe demanded. "What could anyone gain from such systematic murder?" Magnus's expression was grim. "Control. With the established leaders eliminated, their positions would be filled by others, perhaps individuals more amenable to outside influence or internal corruption. The implications were staggering. Their personal crisis was potentially part of a much larger conspiracy aimed at destabilizing the entire region's leadership structure. The attempted murder of Jorund wasn't just personal vengeance, it was political assassination. "We need to set a trap," Jorund decided. "If our poisoner believes their plan is succeeding, they might reveal themselves through their actions." "Dangerous," Gunnar warned. "If they realize we know the truth, they could flee or attempt more direct violence." "More dangerous to let them continue operating," Magnus countered. "The next target might not be as fortunate as you've been." They spent the remainder of the day developing a strategy that would hopefully expose the poisoner while protecting Alva and the rest of the household. The plan required careful coordination and considerable risk. But the alternative, allowing a methodical killer to continue their work, was unacceptable. As evening approached, bringing them to the night before the winter solstice, they found themselves facing multiple climaxes simultaneously. Alva's recovery was progressing well enough that she was beginning to ask coherent questions about her circumstances. The investigation into her poisoning was reaching a critical juncture that would soon require decisive action. And the personal relationship between Jorund and Signe had evolved to a point where its future could no longer be postponed or ignored. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Signe said, as they prepared for what might be their last night maintaining the pretense of marriage, "I want you to know that these days have meant more to me than I expected when I agreed to help." Jorund looked at her across the space that had become their shared domain, seeing not the stranger who had agreed to a desperate bargain, but a woman who had seamlessly integrated herself into his life in ways that felt both natural and profound. "For me as well," he admitted. "I find myself reluctant to return to the way things were before. Then perhaps we don't have to," she suggested. Quietly, the possibility hung between them like a bridge they hadn't quite worked up the courage to cross. Tomorrow would bring resolution to the crisis that had thrown them together, but it might also provide the opportunity to discover whether what they had built could survive transition from desperate necessity to deliberate choice. Outside, The longest night of the year was beginning its slow descent toward dawn, and with it would come answers to questions that had been building for 6 extraordinary days. The solstice would mark not just the turning of the seasons, but the moment when their carefully constructed world would either collapse back into separate lives or transform into something neither had dared to imagine when their strange journey began. The winter solstice arrived with deceptive calm, pale sunlight filtering through low clouds that promised snow before evening. In the hall, Alva sat propped against pillows for the first time in a week, her color notably improved, though she remained weak. The wooden doll rested in her lap while she sipped carefully at a bowl of Signe's nourishing broth. "Tell me again why Signe is here," Alva said, her young mind struggling to piece together the confusing events of her illness. "Is she our family now?" The innocent question struck at the heart of everything they'd been avoiding. Jorund exchanged a meaningful look with Signe before settling beside his daughter's bed. "Sometimes grown-ups make arrangements to help each other," he said carefully. "Signe came to help take care of you when you were very sick, but she wears Mama's ring," Alva observed, with the sharp perception of children. She was referring to the simple silver band Signe wore to support their married facade, one of Astrid's pieces that Jorund had quietly given her days earlier. The mention of the ring sent a jolt through both adults. Neither had expected Alva to notice such details, let alone remember her mother's jewelry well enough to recognize it. "Your papa thought it would be good if I wore it for a while," Signe said gently. "Would that bother you?" Alva considered this with the seriousness of a child making an important decision. "Mama would want someone to take care of us," she said finally. "She told me in a dream that Papa gets lonely." The simple statement brought tears to Jorund's eyes. Even at 8 years old, his daughter possessed an intuitive understanding of emotional needs that adults often struggled to acknowledge. Before anyone could respond to this revelation, a commotion outside drew their attention. Voices were raised in what sounded like argument, followed by the distinctive sound of someone approaching their door with urgent purpose. Eric the Younger burst into the hall without waiting for permission to enter, his face flushed with cold and excitement. Behind him came Olaf the harbour-master and 2 other men from the village council, all wearing expressions of grim determination. "Jorund," Eric announced breathlessly, "we've caught someone tampering with your grain stores. Magnus sent us to fetch you immediately." The trap they had set the previous evening had apparently worked. By spreading word that Jorund was planning another raiding expedition and would need to inspect his supplies, they had hoped to draw the poisoner into revealing themselves through some attempt to refresh or modify the contamination. "Who is it?" Gunnar demanded, reaching for his weapons with practiced efficiency. "Better you see for yourself," Olaf replied grimly. "The identity may surprise you." Jorund felt his blood chill. Someone he trusted, someone he'd considered above suspicion, had been caught in the act of attempting to poison his family. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound could have managed. "Alva will be safe here," Signe assured him, moving protectively closer to the child's bed. "Thora is in the next room, and I won't leave her side." As the men prepared to depart, Alva caught her father's hand with surprising strength. "Papa," she said clearly, "be careful. The bad dreams showed me someone with 2 faces, one that smiles and one that lies." Her words sent a chill through everyone present. Children sometimes possessed insights that adults missed, and Alva's warning carried the weight of prophetic truth. The group made their way quickly through the village streets, their boots crunching on the thin layer of snow that had fallen during the night. Other villagers watched from their doorways, sensing that something significant was happening, but uncertain of its nature. They found Magnus waiting near the storage building behind Jorund's hall, his weathered face bearing an expression of profound disappointment. Several other village elders stood with him, forming a circle around someone who remained hidden from view. "Show yourself," Magnus commanded as they approached. The circle parted to reveal Astrid Olafsdottir, the blacksmith's wife, kneeling in the snow with her hands bound behind her back. In front of her lay a small leather pouch, similar to the one Thora had shown them earlier, along with what appeared to be freshly prepared toxins. The sight hit Jorund like a physical blow. Astrid had been one of his late wife's closest friends, a woman who had helped with Alva's care during her early years, and who had seemed genuinely concerned about the child's recent illness. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying years of trust and bewilderment. Astrid looked up at him with eyes that held no remorse, only cold calculation. "Because you were in the way," she said simply. "Your death would have opened opportunities for those with vision to see them." "What opportunities? What could my death possibly gain you?" Her laugh was bitter and short. "Not for me, you fool. I was promised compensation, yes, but this was never about personal gain. There are forces moving beyond this small village, plans that require reshaping the leadership of our region." Magnus stepped forward, his law speaker's authority lending weight to his questions. "Who promised you compensation? Who benefits from eliminating our established leaders?" "Someone who understands that the old ways are dying," Astrid replied. "Someone who offers a path to prosperity through cooperation rather than endless raiding and warfare." The implications were staggering. The systematic poisonings weren't random acts of malice, but part of a coordinated effort to destabilize traditional Norse leadership, presumably in favor of some outside force or alternative power structure. "You killed innocent children," Eric accused, his voice shaking with rage. "Alva nearly died because of your ambitions." For the first time, Astrid's composure cracked slightly. The child wasn't supposed to be harmed. The dosage was calculated for an adult's consumption over several weeks. "But she shares her father's meals," Gunnar snarled. "Any fool would have known she'd be affected." "I was told the household followed normal patterns," Astrid protested. "Most children eat separately from their parents." The excuse revealed the fundamental callousness of her actions. She had been willing to risk a child's life for political objectives she barely understood, following orders from mysterious benefactors who clearly hadn't bothered to learn basic details about their intended victims. "Who gave you these orders?" Magnus demanded again. "Name your contact." Astrid's expression hardened with malicious satisfaction. "Someone you wouldn't suspect. Someone who's been moving among us for months, gaining trust while laying foundations for necessary changes. Someone who's closer than you think, close enough to complete what I began." If necessary, terror seized Jorund's heart. They had been so focused on catching the known poisoner that they'd failed to adequately protect against an unknown second assassin. While they'd been congratulating themselves on their successful trap, someone else might already be moving against the most vulnerable members of his family. The group broke into a run, racing through the village streets with desperate urgency. Behind them, Astrid's voice called out with cruel certainty, "You're too late. By now, your precious daughter and her new mother have drunk their final meal together." As they rounded the final corner toward Jorund's hall, everything appeared normal. Smoke rising from the roof hole, no sounds of distress. But appearances could be deceiving, and the knowledge that danger might already be inside drove them forward with increasing panic. Jorund burst through his own door like an avenging spirit, his heart hammering with fear of what he might find. The scene that greeted him was both reassuring and confusing. Signe sat calmly beside Alva's bed, while a figure he assumed was Thora worked at a grinding stone. "Papa!" Alva called out with more strength than she'd shown in days. "You're back!" "Signe was telling me about the cats in her father's bakery." Relief flooded through him so powerfully that his knees nearly buckled. But even as he moved toward his daughter, his warrior's instincts remained alert. Astrid's confident assertion that they were too late suggested immediate danger, not future planning. "Has anyone else been here?" he asked Signe, studying her face for signs of distress. "Only your mother," she replied, indicating the figure by the fire. "She arrived shortly after you left to check on Alva's progress." Something cold settled in Jorund's stomach. Thora had been with them when they departed to investigate the disturbance. She couldn't have arrived at his hall shortly after they left unless she'd somehow separated from their group without being noticed. He looked more carefully at the woman grinding herbs by the fire. The figure was bent over her work, face partially concealed by shadows and long grey hair. The build was right, the clothing familiar, but something about her posture seemed subtly wrong. "Mother," he said carefully, "look at me." The figure stiffened, but didn't turn around. "I'm busy with important preparations," she replied in Thora's voice. "The child needs strengthening drafts if she's to fully recover." But now that his attention was focused, Jorund could detect something artificial in the familiar tones. The pitch was correct, but the cadence was slightly off, as if someone were carefully imitating speech patterns they'd studied but not internalized. Gunnar appeared in the doorway behind him, followed by the other men. His brother's eyes immediately went to the figure by the fire, and Jorund saw recognition dawn in his expression. "That's not Thora," Gunnar said quietly. "Mother's hands shake with age when she grinds herbs. Those movements are too steady, too controlled." The false Thora's shoulders tensed further, but she continued her grinding motions. "Old eyes see poorly in dim light," she said, still not turning to face them. "Perhaps you should look more carefully. Then help us see clearly," Jorund said, his hand moving slowly toward his weapon. "Face us and show us your work." The grinding stopped. For a long moment, the only sounds in the hall were the crackling of the fire and Alva's slightly labored breathing. Then the figure straightened and turned around, revealing features that were almost but not quite Thora's. It was Ragnhild, the herb seller's daughter, a woman of perhaps 40 winters, who possessed enough knowledge of healing plants to create deadly poisons. She had used some kind of disguise, aging makeup perhaps, or simple shadows and strategic positioning to pass for the village's beloved healer. In her hands, she held a small clay cup that steamed with recently prepared liquid. The innocent-looking draught was clearly intended for Alva's consumption, and the malicious satisfaction in Ragnhild's eyes revealed its true purpose. "Too late indeed," she said, echoing Astrid's earlier words. "The child has already drunk 1 cup of my special preparation. This second dose will ensure the desired outcome." Horror flooded through Jorund as he realized the magnitude of their oversight. They had been so focused on preventing future poisoning attempts that they'd failed to consider someone might infiltrate their household during the investigation itself. "What did you give her?" Signe demanded, moving protectively between Ragnhild and Alva's bed. "Nothing she won't recover from if she receives proper treatment quickly enough," Ragnhild replied with cruel calculation. "But such treatment requires knowledge that will die with me if I'm not allowed to depart freely." The ultimatum was clear. Let her escape, or watch Alva die from whatever new toxin had been administered. It was a desperate gambit, but one that might succeed given the stakes involved. Alva chose that moment to speak, her young voice cutting through the tension with startling clarity. "She's lying, Papa. I didn't drink anything except what Signe gave me. The pretend grandmother tried to make me, but I remembered what you taught me about strangers." The simple statement shattered Ragnhild's confident facade. Her bluff had been called by the very child she'd intended to murder, and now she faced capture with no leverage to negotiate her freedom. "You little," she began, raising the poisoned cup as if to throw its contents at Alva. She never completed the motion. Jorund's seax, thrown with the precision of years of combat experience, struck her wrist with enough force to shatter bone. The cup flew from her grip, its deadly contents splashing harmlessly against the stone wall. As Ragnhild collapsed, clutching her ruined wrist and screaming in pain and fury, the true scope of their victory became clear. They had not only exposed the conspiracy against their community's leadership, but had prevented the final, most personal attack against his family. 3 days later, with both conspirators securely imprisoned and awaiting Magnus's judgment, life in the village began to return to normal rhythms. Alva's recovery continued steadily under Thora's genuine care, her strength returning along with her natural curiosity about the world around her. But the question that had been building throughout their extraordinary week could no longer be avoided. Their arrangement had fulfilled its purpose. Alva was healing, the threat had been eliminated, and their community was safe. Yet neither Jorund nor Signe seemed eager to discuss ending what they had begun. "The solstice has passed," Signe said quietly, as they sat beside Alva's bed on the third evening after the crisis. "Your daughter no longer needs the protection of ancient rituals." "No," Jorund agreed, though his voice lacked conviction. "I suppose our agreement has reached its natural conclusion." Alva, who had been listening to their careful conversation with the sharp attention of a child who sensed important decisions being made around her, chose that moment to intervene. "Are you going to send Signe away?" she asked directly. "Because I don't want her to leave. She makes better bread than anyone, and she knows the best stories. And she doesn't get scared when I have bad dreams." The innocent plea cut straight to the heart of what none of them had been willing to address directly. Over the course of 7 extraordinary days, they had become something that resembled a real family in ways that went far beyond their original, desperate pretense. "What would you like to happen?" Signe asked the child gently. "I want you to stay forever and be my real mama," Alva said with the straightforward honesty that only children possess. "Papa smiles more when you're here, and the house feels warm even when the fire burns low." Jorund felt his throat tighten with emotion. His daughter had articulated something he'd been struggling to understand himself, that Signe's presence had brought life back to spaces that had been merely functional for too long. "And what do you want?" he asked Signe, finally daring to voice the question that had been haunting him for days. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently stroking Alva's hair as she considered her response. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of careful thought. "I want to build something real from what we started in desperation," she said quietly. "I want to discover whether what we felt during our week of pretending can grow into something lasting and true, even knowing it began as deception." "Especially knowing that," she replied. "We've seen each other under the worst possible circumstances, exhausted, frightened, pretending to be something we weren't. If we can care for each other through that, perhaps we can build something strong enough to last through whatever comes next." 3 months later, as spring began to assert itself across the fjord, Magnus the law speaker performed a ceremony that differed significantly from their original desperate arrangement. This time, Jorund and Signe spoke their vows before the entire community, with genuine emotion replacing calculated necessity. Alva stood beside them wearing a new dress that Signe had sewn specifically for the occasion, her health fully restored and her face bright with happiness. In her hands, she held both the wooden doll that had anchored her to life during her darkest hours and the small carved whale that Gunnar had brought from distant seas. As the ceremony concluded and the celebration began, Jorund reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. What had started as a desperate lie told to save a dying child had evolved into the foundation for genuine love and lasting commitment. Sometimes, he thought, the gods worked in ways that seemed cruel but ultimately revealed hidden wisdom. His family had been broken by loss and then threatened by deliberate evil. But from that darkness had emerged something stronger and more beautiful than what had existed before. "Do you ever regret agreeing to my desperate request?" he asked Signe as they watched their daughter, for she was truly their daughter now, playing with the other village children. "Never," she replied without hesitation. "It brought me exactly where I belonged, even if I didn't know I was looking for this place." As the sun set on their wedding day, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, the truth of ancient wisdom became clear. Sometimes the most precious things in life grow from the smallest seeds, planted in desperate soil but nurtured with unexpected love.